April 1945. Berlin is a city on fire, a city crumbling under relentless assault. The streets are filled with rubble, smoke, and the echoes of distant artillery. Every building seems to be a trap, every corner a potential death sentence. The Red Army has encircled the city, 2.5 million soldiers pressing in from all sides, and the German defenders are exhausted, starving, and desperately outnumbered. Civilians wander the streets like ghosts, clutching whatever belongings they could salvage, their faces hollow with fear. Underground, in the cold, dimly lit corridors of the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler is seated over a map, his hands shaking, his eyes wild with determination. He refuses to accept that the Reich is finished. The city above is falling, but he believes he can still orchestrate a miracle, a counterattack that will somehow turn the tide. Around him, his generals exchange uneasy glances. They know the truth. The plan is impossible. Supplies are gone, tanks are scarce, and morale has collapsed. But Hitler continues to insist, pointing to the map, shouting orders, his voice a mix of desperation and fury. Each second in the bunker is heavy with tension, every word a potential spark for chaos. Outside, the civilians of Berlin are facing horrors unimaginable. Families huddle in cellars, desperately trying to survive as artillery shells flatten entire streets. Schools, hospitals, and homes no longer exist as safe spaces. The city's young boys and elderly men, hastily conscripted into the Volkssturm, patrol the streets with rifles far too large for their hands. Smoke and fire rise above the city like a black cloud, the sky darkened not just by destruction, but by despair. Every hour brings news of yet another district, another street, falling to the relentless Soviet advance. The sound of artillery is constant, mingling with cries, explosions, and the rumble of tanks, creating a symphony of terror that blankets the entire city. Yet in the bunker, Hitler's obsession blinds him completely to reality. He is convinced that a concentrated attack, led by the SS, can somehow punch through Soviet lines and relieve Berlin. It is here, in this final crucible of desperation, that Felix Steiner, one of the most experienced SS commanders in the entire German military, is summoned. Steiner's name carries weight. He has led men through some of the fiercest battles of the Eastern Front, commanding respect and fear alike. But now he is asked to do what many consider impossible: organize an attack with insufficient troops against an enemy who vastly outnumbers and outguns them, with the city and its people teetering on the brink of annihilation. As the sound of artillery echoes even in the depths of the bunker, Steiner assesses the situation calmly, his mind calculating, aware of the lives at stake. Hitler, however, is lost in a storm of fantasy and fury, convinced that courage and obedience alone can change the course of history. In the corridors above, the city itself seems to scream in agony. Fires rage uncontrollably, smoke chokes the air, and the distant thunder of tanks and guns is constant. Civilians, soldiers, and young conscripts alike are caught in a nightmare that seems without end. Food is scarce, water is almost gone, and the cries of the wounded echo through the ruins. In the bunker, Hitler's aides shift nervously. They have seen his outbursts before, but never like this. His insistence that Steiner launch an immediate attack seems disconnected from any reality. The tension is palpable, every word and glance heavy with unspoken fear. The fate of Berlin, the lives of thousands, and the final hours of the Third Reich hang in the balance. It is in this moment of chaos, desperation, and moral collapse that the story of Felix Steiner begins to unfold, a story of rare clarity, courage, and the choice to defy an impossible order, a choice that would spare countless lives in a city already burning. The stage is set, the players are in place, and history waits to witness the decisions that will define the end of an era. Felix Steiner was not a man defined by ideology, but by discipline experience, and an unyielding understanding of the battlefield. Born in 1996 in East Prussia, he grew up in a world still haunted by the aftermath of the First World War. His military career began in the Imperial German Army, where he learned the harsh lessons of leadership, strategy, and survival. Over the decades, Steiner carved out a reputation as a commander who could take responsibility for impossible missions and keep his men alive, even under the most brutal conditions. By the time the Second World War engulfed Europe, he had risen through the ranks of the Waffen-SS, gaining the respect of both his peers and his enemies. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Steiner was known for his analytical mind. He studied the terrain, he calculated risks, and he never let emotion dictate his decisions. On the Eastern Front, he led his units through some of the fiercest fighting in history, facing the Soviet army in engagements that demanded courage, endurance, and ingenuity. Soldiers under his command spoke of a leader who understood the human cost of war, who valued the lives of his men, even while pursuing the orders of superiors who often did not. By 1945, Steiner was considered one of the most experienced SS commanders alive, a man Hitler trusted to execute operations with precision. It was that trust that brought him to the Führerbunker in April, summoned to receive an order that defied logic, morality, and reality. Steiner's reputation was built not only on battlefield victories, but also on his ability to remain calm in the face of chaos. While Berlin burned and the world outside descended into pandemonium, Steiner's mind worked methodically, assessing troop strength, enemy positions, and the feasibility of the mission. Unlike many commanders who would have attempted the impossible out of fear or loyalty, Steiner relied on facts, not fanaticism. He understood that sending poorly equipped, exhausted troops against overwhelming Soviet forces would result in mass death, not victory. Even Hitler, who had a peculiar obsession with loyalty and blind obedience, had to respect Steiner's capabilities. To many, he appeared loyal, disciplined, and obedient, but in reality, Steiner's loyalty was to his men, to practical military judgment, and to the rules of survival that no ideology could override. His presence in Berlin represented a rare point of clarity amid the delusion of the Führerbunker. He had witnessed the collapse of armies, the fall of cities, and the moral bankruptcy of many leaders around him. Steiner had seen firsthand how blind obedience could destroy entire units, leaving nothing but death and ruin, and he had vowed never to be an instrument of such needless carnage. But Steiner remained focused, calculating what was possible, and perhaps more importantly, what was necessary to save lives. As the Führerbunker descended further into irrationality, Steiner's calm and measured demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. Generals who had spent years under Hitler's command recognized in Steiner a man who could see what others refused to acknowledge, that some orders, no matter how sacred they seemed to the Reich, were simply impossible to carry out. And so, as Hitler prepared to issue his final, catastrophic directive, Steiner stood at the edge of history, a man whose experience, intellect, and moral clarity would soon place him in a position to make a choice that very few in the Third Reich had ever dared to make. By mid-April 1945, Hitler's obsession had reached a point few could comprehend. He was convinced that Berlin could still be saved, not by negotiation, not by retreat, but by a sudden, concentrated counterattack. The plan was audacious in its ambition, catastrophic in its reality. He ordered Felix Steiner, one of the most capable SS commanders, to lead an offensive that would pierce the Soviet lines surrounding the city. Hitler pointed to the map, tracing imaginary routes with his finger, insisting that Steiner's units would break through and relieve the encircled garrison. He spoke of divisions that, on paper, existed, but in reality were scattered, under strength, or barely functional. Steiner listened, quietly calculating the numbers, the terrain, and the odds. He knew that the forces Hitler expected him to command were fragmented remnants, exhausted by months of retreat and battle. Tanks were nearly non-existent, ammunition was scarce, and soldiers were demoralized, their energy spent just surviving the bombardment and harsh conditions. The Soviet forces, by contrast, were overwhelming. Armored units, artillery, and infantry pressed inward from every direction, coordinating assaults with devastating efficiency. Their encirclement was near perfect, a tightening noose that would allow no margin for error, no room for a miracle. Hitler's generals watched as he described the relief attack, each word more fantastical than the last. They knew that Steiner could not possibly assemble an army capable of achieving the impossible. Yet Hitler's rage and desperation drowned out reason. In his mind, obedience and courage could overcome logistics, numbers, and the reality of the battlefield. Steiner considered the map, tracing routes, calculating distances, counting divisions, and factoring in what he knew of Soviet strength. It was clear, any attempt would result in annihilation. He also understood that Hitler's map did not reflect reality, that the divisions drawn in neat lines existed only as illusions, not actual combat units. Steiner's men, already exhausted from continuous retreats and defensive fighting, could not launch a coordinated offensive. Any attack would be suicide, not strategy. The city itself was already lost. Berlin was a fortress in name only, a city surrounded by fire, rubble, and the relentless advance of the Red Army. Civilians and conscripts alike were caught in the middle, their lives hanging on the decisions of a man increasingly detached from reality. The tension in the bunker was palpable. Hitler, growing more agitated, demanded immediate action. Officers exchanged glances, knowing that defiance might be dangerous, yet understanding that compliance could cost thousands of lives. Steiner's mind raced as he weighed the order against the stark reality. He knew that saying yes would mean sending men to their deaths for a plan that could never succeed. Yet saying no was almost unthinkable in a regime where disobedience was punishable by death. The impossible choice weighed heavily on him, but his training, experience, and moral clarity guided him. As Hitler continued to outline what he believed would be a turning point, Steiner silently prepared himself. He understood that the fate of Berlin, the lives of his men, and perhaps the legacy of the Waffen-SS rested on his next words. The map in front of them, covered with symbols, divisions, and arrows, was supposed to be a blueprint for salvation. Instead, for Steiner, it was a clear illustration of futility. He realized that the city could not be saved by force, that the Soviet lines were too strong, too numerous, and too coordinated. Any attempt to follow Hitler's orders would be a slaughter, a pointless sacrifice in the name of delusion. And so, in the quiet, tense moments that would define history, Steiner made a decision few in the Third Reich would dare to make. He chose to see reality, to protect his men, and to refuse the order, knowing full well the fury and consequences that might follow. The relief attack, the plan that Hitler believed would save Berlin, remained on paper, never executed, a testament to the gulf between fantasy and reality, between blind obedience and reason. Steiner's assessment of the map, the divisions, and the terrain was brutally simple. It could not succeed, and in that simple truth lay the courage that would define him in history, even if the world would rarely remember his name.
The moment Steiner spoke changed everything. In the crowded, dimly lit Führerbunker, his words cut through the tension like a blade. "I cannot carry out this attack," he said, steady, calm, and deliberate. The room fell silent. Officers exchanged shocked glances, knowing the weight of what had just been spoken. Hitler froze, his face a mask of disbelief, fury, and confusion. For weeks, the Führerbunker had been a place of escalating desperation, but no one had seen him confronted with defiance like this. Steiner's refusal was more than a personal decision, it was a direct challenge to the illusion of control Hitler clung to so desperately. Above them, Berlin was collapsing. The Soviet artillery continued to hammer the city, buildings crumbled, and civilians ran through streets filled with fire and smoke. Steiner knew that any attempt to follow Hitler's plan would be suicide. He had calculated the odds, weighed the lives of his men, and concluded that obedience would mean the pointless deaths of thousands. This clarity of thought was rare in a regime that punished independent reasoning. Hitler's reaction was immediate and explosive. His face twisted with rage, his hands shaking as he slammed them on the map in front of him. He screamed, accusing Steiner of betrayal, of cowardice, of ruining the Reich. His voice echoed through the bunker, bouncing off the concrete walls, filling the underground corridors with a fury that had nothing left to do with strategy and everything to do with delusion. Those present later recalled the scene as one of the final, undeniable breakdowns of Hitler's mental state. The man who had ruled with terror, who had orchestrated entire campaigns with an iron fist, now trembled before a single command he could not enforce. Yet Steiner did not waver. He understood that his duty was not to a dictator's fantasy, but to the lives of the soldiers under his command. He calmly outlined the reality. The divisions were fragmented, the enemy overwhelming, and any attack would be annihilation, not salvation. The tension in the bunker was suffocating. Officers who had spent years under Hitler's command were stunned. Some felt relief that reason had appeared, even if briefly. Others feared the consequences of defiance. The room, once filled with the expectation of orders, now held a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief. Steiner's men, far above in the streets and rubble of Berlin, unknowingly benefited from his courage. By refusing to obey a suicidal directive, he spared countless lives, men who would have been sent into a trap without hope. Outside, the sounds of battle continued, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath the city. Explosions, screams, and the relentless pounding of artillery painted a stark picture of the cost of war and the thin line between life and death. Inside the bunker, Hitler's breakdown was both psychological and symbolic. The Führer, convinced of his own invincibility, faced the undeniable reality that his command had limits. Steiner's refusal was not just a tactical decision, it was a moral one, a rare act of clarity in an environment consumed by ideology, fanaticism, and fear. Historians later described it as one of the few moments when logic overrode blind obedience in the highest echelons of the Third Reich. Steiner had made his choice. He had defied the impossible order, saved his men, and forced Hitler to confront, however briefly, the unchangeable reality of the battlefield. The consequences of his decision would ripple through the final days of Berlin, shaping the survival of those under his command and marking one of the rare acts of courage and pragmatism in the midst of absolute chaos. Even as the city burned and the Reich crumbled above them, Steiner's defiance became a quiet beacon of reason, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, one man's clarity could protect lives and preserve the humanity that total war so often destroys. The weight of his decision extended beyond the immediate moment. It would shape how historians understood the collapse of Berlin and reveal the few instances of moral courage that emerged from the madness of the Third Reich. Steiner's choice was not applauded, not recorded in grand monuments, but it quietly ensured that the final chapter of many lives was written with restraint rather than unnecessary slaughter, a rare glimmer of humanity in a city consumed by death.
Felix Steiner's decision to refuse Hitler's final order did not make headlines. It did not earn him fame or accolades. History in many ways forgot him, as if the story of restraint and reason was too quiet to compete with the chaos and destruction of the final days of Berlin. Yet his choice carried immense significance. By refusing a suicidal attack, he preserved the lives of thousands of soldiers who might otherwise have been sent into certain death. Each man spared was a life that could survive beyond the ruins of the city, a life that might one day bear witness to the truth of those desperate days. Steiner's defiance also revealed a rare glimpse of humanity amid the fanaticism of the Third Reich. While many commanders blindly followed orders to the bitter end, often resulting in mass casualties, Steiner prioritized reason over obedience. He understood the limits of his resources, the reality of the battlefield, and the value of human life in a war where ideology too often replaced morality. Historians have since described Steiner's choice as one of the few moments of clarity and courage in a regime dominated by terror, delusion, and blind loyalty. It was a reminder that even within an organization built on fear and cruelty, individual agency could still make a difference. After the war, Steiner faded from public attention. He was not celebrated. He did not seek recognition. He returned to a world grappling with the aftermath of devastation, and like many of his generation, he carried the weight of experience, both heroic and tragic. For those who survived under his command, his decision was not theoretical, it meant life. Families were spared the grief of losing sons and fathers who might have been needlessly sacrificed. His name is often overlooked in the grand narratives of World War II, buried beneath accounts of battles, dictators, and mass destruction. Yet for those who study the collapse of Berlin, his decision is a critical point of insight. It illustrates that even in the final, desperate moments of a regime, reason and morality could survive, quietly shaping outcomes without fanfare. Steiner's legacy is not in monuments or textbooks, but in the lives he protected and the moral courage he demonstrated. Even decades later, historians and military analysts reflect on what his refusal represented. It challenges the assumption that obedience under a totalitarian system is absolute, showing that judgment and conscience can survive even in the darkest circumstances. Steiner's story reminds us that leadership is not always about glory or conquest. Sometimes it is about the restraint to refuse the impossible, the wisdom to see reality, and the bravery to act on that understanding despite immense pressure. In a bunker filled with fear, chaos, and delusion, Steiner made a choice that history may barely remember, but that fundamentally altered the fate of those under his command. His actions demonstrate that the true measure of leadership is not only in victories won, but in lives saved, in the courage to stand against impossible orders, and in the clarity to see reality when others refuse to acknowledge it. As Berlin fell and the Reich crumbled around him, Steiner emerged as a rare example of reason, moral courage, and humanity, a man who, in the face of a dictator's final destructive order, chose life over death, prudence over fanaticism, and conscience over ideology. Though his name is largely forgotten, the significance of his actions resonates as a quiet but profound testament to the impact one individual can have, even in the darkest, most desperate moments of history, and serves as a lasting reminder of the power of courage, judgment, and moral clarity. His choice also echoes through time as a lesson that true leadership demands wisdom, foresight, and the courage to act against impossible odds, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the preservation of human life and the enduring truth that morality must sometimes triumph over blind loyalty. Steiner's legacy, though unsung, remains a beacon of reason amid one of history's most chaotic and destructive periods, a demonstration that even in total collapse, humanity can endure. His decision reminds us that even under the most extreme pressure, one individual can make choices that ripple through history, proving that courage, wisdom, and humanity can survive in moments when the world seems entirely lost. By standing firm, Steiner showed that conscience is not an abstract principle, but a force capable of saving lives and shaping the course of events, leaving a mark on history that, while quiet, is immeasurably important.